Marcel Proust began one of the most famous novels of the 20th century with a passage in which the protagonist bites into a tiny cake served with tea, and it triggers a flood of childhood memories. And perhaps a more familiar example, when Anton Ego is served a plate of ratatouille, he is thrown back to a childhood reverie that proves life-changing. Why is it that particular events become etched in our minds, seemingly impossible to forget, while so many of us cannot even remember what we wore yesterday? Well, as we all know intuitively, there is a very powerful link between memory and emotion. Our brains prioritize emotional memories for encoding and recall, and the more intense the emotion, whether positive or negative, the more intense the memory. But where in our brain do these memories exist, and how are they stored? What happens when these processes go awry and either new memories, however emotional the experience, cannot be formed, or the brain goes overboard and stores every experience? And to what extent do our brains take creative liberties, crafting deeply emotional memories of things that never actually happened? Many of the processes that determine how we encode and retrieve memories remain a mystery. Nevertheless, the last decade has witnessed enormous progress. Scientists at Columbia University recently identified a specific neural circuit that tags information with emotional associations, thereby enhancing memory. At least 2 other teams in the United States are currently working on prosthetic devices to boost fading memories via electronic stimulation, and here in Australia, genes once derided as junk have been shown to play a pivotal role in regulating fear. That research has even revealed that emotional events may reshape us down to our very DNA. At the same time, there's also new hope for those experiencing the debilitating consequences of the most traumatic of such emotionally evocative events. This evening, we will talk to a group of leading scientists whose research illuminates these and other vital links between memory and emotion. Their work seeks to reveal how the rich swirl of memory, emotion, and self-awareness shapes who we are as individual human beings. And that's the issue which will serve as our guide tonight as we take a deep dive into memory, the pathways that make us human.
Good evening. Thank you. So I'm Brian Greene, co-founder of the World Science Festival with Tracy Day, and it is our great pleasure to finally be back here in Brisbane live and in person. Last time, of course, is back in 2019, which of course does strain the memory with everything that has happened in between. It certainly has been a traumatic time in many different ways, but when I consider my own memories, when I try to push myself to really think back to the earliest memory that I really can conjure up in my mind, it's the following. It's a bright, sunny day. I'm in a stroller. My dad is pushing me along, and I'm playing with little beads that are on a rod right in front of the stroller. And my dad pushes us down 81st Street, makes a right turn, goes to 82nd and Columbus in Manhattan to his favorite hot dog stand. I don't know if you have hot dogs, as you call them here, but you know, it's like a little cylindrical piece of beef, right? Well, they call it beef. I really don't know what the heck they have in there. But anyway, so my dad buys himself a hot dog, and he buys me one. Usually they come in a piece of bread, a bun, but for me, a little toddler, he gives it to me in my hand, and I take a bite, crunch, and I eat it. Now, as someone who's been a vegetarian since 9 years old, that memory is actually kind of traumatic, thinking back to that. But here's the thing. When I actually think of that memory, I can feel the day. I can feel the stroller going down the street, hitting the bumps in the sidewalk. I can feel the warmth of the hot dog. I can really taste and smell the crunch. But I'm seeing it in third person. I'm watching myself do that. And so it's not an actual memory, or at least it's a modified memory, or a changed memory, or in some sense, my telling of that story over the years, say to my kids and my family, has somehow transformed the way I reflect back on an event that actually did happen, but in my mind, it now takes a different form. And so that's central to the kind of question that we are going to be investigating and exploring here tonight. How is it that memories are encoded? How can they be modified? How do they stay stable over long periods of time? And what happens when that stability starts to drop away? And can memories be volitionally manipulated or modified? And when we get to the point where perhaps we're able to do that, the question is, should we, or can we, or will we? And to guide us in exploring these questions tonight, we have four wonderful experts, participants who I'd like to bring in now. Our first guest is Timothy Bredy, who is a professor of cognitive neuroepigenetics at the Queensland Brain Institute, where his lab studies the fundamental molecular mechanisms underlying fear-related learning and memory. Welcome, Tim.
Hi.
Yes, thank you. Our next guest is Veronica O'Keane, who's a neuroscientist, a retired professor of psychiatry, and a consultant psychiatrist at Trinity College Dublin with over 30 years' experience in the field. She's the author of A Sense of Self, Memory, the Brain, and Who We Are. Welcome, Veronica. Next, we have Gail Robinson, who is the director of the Clinical Neuropsychology Doctoral Program at the University of Queensland. She is a clinical neuropsychologist whose research focuses in part on brain behavior relationships. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you.
And finally, rounding out our group here tonight is Oliver Baumann, who is an assistant professor in the School of Psychology at Bond University, whose research focuses on human spatial perception, memory, and emotion. Welcome, Oliver, and of course, welcome to you all. So you all study memory. That's your day job, or perhaps even beyond your day job. Your own memory. I gave one example where I sort of can push myself back to probably 2-ish, something like that, 3-ish. What do we know? How far back can people typically go, and how far back do each of you go, and do you trust those memories? Tim, why don't you start us off?
For myself, I think some of my first memories were probably at the age of 3. And I can remember one moment where I fell off a balcony in the front of the house into a rose bush.
That could have been your last memory, your first and your last.
I remember the thorns.
Wow, yeah. And is that why you remember?
Yeah, the emotion attached to it.
Yeah, so we'll get into that,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, so Veronica?
The first memory that I have is looking down on an orange cardigan that my mother knit and remembering the curvature of the button. At the time, I was sitting on something which I later found out was a box because we were moving house. So clearly that made an impact on me. I was about 3, again, around the same age.
Right, absolutely. So Gail, how about you?
Well, I think I'm a bit older, actually. I was trying to think, is there anything before 5? And I really just have maybe 2 memories of, I think I was about 5. One, we'd caught the train across from Canberra all the way to Perth as a family, and I remember being in the lounge room of my grandparents' place in Perth. We were playing a card game or some sort of game, but I wasn't allowed to play because I was probably being naughty. So I just remember being told off for some reason. I don't remember much else. But
so there was some trauma there too then, right? At some level.
There was some trauma there, yes.
Oliver?
Yeah, actually, I would have a problem knowing which one was the first, but I have a couple of early ones which would be around 3 to 4 years of age. including one where I made my first ever purchase. I remember buying like a little bag of stickers in the shop, and my mother sent me in with the coin to buy it myself. So I must have been 3 or 4 at that stage. And that's one of the early memories.
So those are early memories, and I think, all of us have some variation on the themes. The details differ, but we can usually push ourselves pretty far back. There are many things, most things, in fact, in our lives we don't directly remember. I mean, if you were to ask me, what I was doing on whatever, May 17th of 2006, I'd be very hard-pressed to give an answer to that. But there are some dates that we all do remember. For instance, 9/11, right? I mean, 9/11 is one that, I don't think there's anybody who was around at the time that doesn't have a pretty sharp, vivid memory of that day. So, part of it's obvious, right? That was a very different day. But can you take us a little bit further, say, Tim, just to get us going? What is it about that kind of an experience that leaves such a lasting impact in our memories?
I think it's anything that has a lot of emotion attached to it and a lot of surprise that kind of triggers the pathways in the brain to etch those memories for the long term, right? So, with respect to 9/11, I remember exactly where I was.
Where were you?
I was in a car driving to the New York border with my friend who was from Jordan, to get his visa renewed.
Huh.
Yeah, we didn't make it to the border that day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And I suspect you didn't cross that border for a long time. Yeah, be my guess. Yeah. Oliver, can you take that any further? Is there something about the power of emotion that primes the brain?
Yeah, so emotion is obviously an important currency for the brain to know when to encode something or not, because encoding in memory is expensive for the brain. And therefore, emotion serves then as a signal to, how much to invest and, what memories to prioritize and how much, effort to put into it to encode them. So therefore, without emotion, we would unnecessarily encode information we might not need to, and, that's a huge cost to the system.
But could you imagine, and Veronica, we're going to come to a specific example where you're going to take us through some of the neurophysiology that actually is behind this, but more fancifully, can you imagine, perhaps a life form, maybe even on this planet, but let's imagine an extraterrestrial life form that is able to form memories in a selective manner, but is not based on emotion? Is that a peculiarity of the human species, or do you think that's sort of a general quality, nature's way of having a selection effect on which memories we should store, answer the ones that have the biggest emotional impact?
Well, I think that it's pretty ubiquitous in nature for a survival mechanism to have a driver, like emotionally relevant memories or intense memories are typically the ones that are causing threat or fear in us, and that's absolutely essential for survival, right? So it's across all species.
Yeah. So given that, Veronica, can you take us through, you have some slides where you can lay out to get a sense of a traumatic experience yielding a certain kind of emotional response that generates a memory. So you can take us through this example.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to say in relation to emotion and memory is that emotion is energy. And that is the energy that lights up the neurons in our brain. And the energy can be internally generated or externally generated. And 9/11 was a fantastic example of a stimulus that was globally experienced and that was individually experienced and that we all remember. But we also remember it in a collective way. So there is a collective memory and a collective emotion that's present. What I'm going to talk about is something that isn't collective. It's something that we're all familiar with, but thankfully, at least not in my lifetime, and hopefully not in most of your lifetimes, will you be ever confronted with this threat. So the threat I'm going to talk about is a gun being put to your head. So what happens when a gun is put to somebody's head or something threatening like that is the light waves from the gun, the image goes to the back of the eye. That, of course, is a form of energy. Light wave is a form of energy that's converted to electrical energy. And the electrical energy travels along the neurons to the back of the brain, to the visual cortex. Now, the brain is surrounded by the cortex, and the cortex essentially interprets the sensory world. It interprets the visual world in the back of the brain, the auditory world, the touch world. So all of the senses come to the surface of the brain, and after they land there, and already our visual cortex knows what a gun looks like because we've learnt it as we've developed. And the signal then shoots into the center of the brain, into a place called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is absolutely central to memory because it's the memory maker in the brain. So the memory maker in the brain is directly adjacent to a structure called the amygdala. And the amygdala is what I call the emotional spark plug of the brain. And frequently we speak about the emotional center and we speak about the memory center. But in reality, the physiology is that these two structures are so densely interconnected, and so the neurons and the dendrites and the connections between them are almost inextricable. So as you see the gun, the memory is immediately triggering an emotion in the amygdala. So we've gone from visual sensory to identifying that to memory to emotional center in the brain. And this translates into experiences in the body, into the sense of fear, through the signals from the amygdala going to a place called the hypothalamus, which is just above the surface of the brain. And the hypothalamus is the headquarters for the autonomic nervous system in the body. And that mediates the flight and fight response at an extreme, but also other emotions that may not be as extreme. It could just perhaps pump your heart with excitement. It could be a sad image. It might make you have a crushing sensation in your chest. So the range of experiences that the autonomic nervous system mediates in our body is very variable, and it's a whole range of emotions there. But essentially, they're being manipulated through the hypothalamus and the autonomic nervous system. And I think it's important in terms of trauma, because we're all interested in trauma here, is that if something very severe is threatening an individual, that this very same memory system of the hippocampus and the amygdala and the hypothalamus activates another system in the body, the endocrine stress system. So you have exactly the same brain circuitry if a threat is very severe that activates the stress hormone about 10 or 20 minutes later, depending on the severity of the threat. And this system is not a nervous system. It goes into the bloodstream and it carries a hormone from the hypothalamus to the adrenal glands. And in the adrenal glands, the hormone cortisol is released. So you can see here how acutely the body deals with an immediate stress by releasing adrenaline and the peripheral nervous system in the body. And then over time, a more sustained response in terms of cortisol kicks in to keep us vigilant, to monitor the stress.
But presumably that serves an evolutionary function of survival, but presumably if you have a sustained release of these hormones, it begins to act against the being. That's the case as well, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. There's a thing called allostatic load, which is basically the wear and tear that stress wreaks on the body. And too much cortisol, I've done a lot of research in depression, and one of the main areas of research that I've been involved in fact, is looking at the effect of cortisol on the brain. And very interestingly, in terms of memory, cortisol has specific effects on the memory center in the brain, on the hippocampus. So if we're severely stressed over long periods of time, and of course depression is one of the most extreme forms of mental and emotional and cognitive stress, well, you're actually damaging your memory by being in a sustained state of depression.
Absolutely. So the hippocampus over time, following chronic exposure to stress hormone, the dendrites, the neurons start to retract. The hippocampus actually shrinks. But at the cost of it, the amygdala actually does the opposite. So the emotional center expands. It shows hypertrophy. So you can see there becomes a shift in a bias towards strong emotional responses. So at the cost of memory, though.
But is that sort of a kind of runaway process? It sounds like it'll feed on itself.
It would, yep. And over time, there's...
Well, it's called the cascade hypothesis because the more stress you have, the smaller your hippocampus becomes, the more emotionally driven you become. And this, of course, creates more stress, which feeds back and further damages the memory center.
So, Oliver, just to go back a bit to the evolutionary roots of this all, back in 1872, Charles Darwin published a somewhat lesser-known volume in the general world, but certainly a volume that's well-known in the academic world, describing the emergence of emotions as a quality of the human species. And so, what's our view today on the evolutionary roots of emotion and the way that feeds into the formation of memory?
Yeah, I guess I think an important aspect highlighted by Darwin is that emotions have a function, because when we experience them in day-to-day life, often we feel they're just there to reward us or punish us, and we want more of the good and less of the bad emotions. But obviously, they've been put in place through evolution to ensure survival, so that even the simplest form of animals would probably feel good if they find a little bit of nutrition, and feel bad if there's like bit of water that's too hot or too cold. And so from the simplest forms of animals to the highest forms, emotions have evolved to guide us to the good things that allow us to prosper, survive, and grow, and then keep us away from the bad things. And our brain has evolved in humans, of course, compared to simple animals, but still the same mechanisms that emotions are essentially there to protect us and to guide us, and that then also via the memories.
Now, Gail, we were talking so far about memory as if it's a single thing, right? I mean, there's so many, at least from an intuitive standpoint, different kinds of memory, right? I know how to drive to our house in the country. I don't even think about it, but somehow my memory takes me there. I'm speaking right now. I'm not trying to draw up the words by searching in my memory, but somehow it's happening, right? And yet there are other memories when we talk about them where they're really there in a more definite form as opposed to something that's in the background. So you can take us through the different kinds of memory and perhaps even give us a sense of how does the brain decide which kind of memory mechanism to use?
Yes, so there are different memories. We always, I guess when people talk about my memory's not so good, really they're talking about episodic memory. And our episodic memory is really our memory for ongoing events. So where was I when this happened? So right now we're actually forming an episodic memory. We're all here together, we're at this memory event. This is a certain place and time. It's tagged, it's specific to right now. So this becomes a personal autobiographic memory as well of this event. And now another type of memory is what we call semantic memory. That's our facts about the world. So that's our knowledge, our general knowledge. We can define memory. We can look it up in the dictionary. It's almost the dictionary definitions. That's our semantics. But both the semantic and episodic are also what we call declarative. So I can tell you about it, I can tell you about that event, I can tell you about a fact about memory. Memory in the hippocampus is a crucial center. So that's a semantic fact that I can declare. Now, those things are not quite as separate as they seem, because tonight we're learning about memory, and maybe for you it might be the first time, but as you learn more about memory, it becomes free from tonight, and that becomes more of a semantic knowledge fact. But these are all, again, explicit or what we can talk about. That's contrasted with implicit memories, or what we can learn as a procedure or a process. So learning to ride a bike, you probably, I don't know if you can remember exactly when it happened, but
I do, yeah.
Most people, when you learn to ride a bike, somehow you just do it. You actually can't tell me exactly how you learnt it or how to do it. It's sort of, we know you learnt because you no longer put your feet on the ground, you're not wobbling, you're stable, and you're not crashing, and perhaps you're going very fast now. So that implicit memory is different, and it's
sometimes when you try to explain what you're doing, you don't do it as well, right?
That's exactly right. And one other type of memory I guess we should talk about is the working memory, our short-term memory, which is, most people think short-term memory is the thing that you keep for a few days or a few months or a few years, but it's actually just a few seconds up to a minute. So have a short-term or a working memory, you've got to hold the information like a phone number. If I tell you my phone number, Veronica, you can keep rehearsing it till you put it in your phone and write it down. But if you don't rehearse it or put it somewhere, it disappears. So that working memory is very temporary and it needs work to keep it up. So all those different memory systems are useful for different things. If you're working out your grocery bill, you're going to do your working memory, or if you're trying to tally up whether you've got enough money. But if you're going to QPAC for a memory event, then next week you'll talk about that as an episode. It'll be part of your autobiographic memory.
And so do we understand at the level of, say, brain physiology, or perhaps even right down to a molecular level, the different kinds of memories, the different
Absolutely.
detailed processes?
People talk about functional neuroanatomy or networks now, but actually the neuropsychology, when we work with patients with brain damage, we actually have very good lesion or damage in the brain behavior relationships. So things like the episodic memory, we've all been talking about the hippocampus, and that's certainly the memory center for episodes and the personal memories to encode. But in terms of the semantic memories, really we talk about the anterior temporal lobes bilaterally, so slightly different area. And then our working memory, depending on whether it's for verbal information, like a phone number that you hear, or if you, say, go to an art gallery and you look at a nice painting, it's a sketch or a picture. So that is very much in the right hemisphere as opposed to the auditory verbal. What you hear is more in the left, but a different part of the brain than your personal memories and the semantic facts. And then the implicit or learning motor skills is, again, slightly different. So there are different parts of the brain that support the different types of memory. And one other thing I just probably should say is our frontal lobes have a very big role in encoding, being able to focus your attention to see what is that information, how am I going to get it into the store or via the hippocampus. You know, you need to organize the information perhaps, you need to do things to it in order for the information to go in well, and then to retrieve it at a later point. Again, that's the frontal lobes. The left and the right have different roles.
But from an evolutionary perspective, the thing that has always perplexed me a little bit, but again, evolution is a random process, so it's not like it was fine-tuned by some being above to be optimized. But why do we have to work so hard to get certain kind of learning and certain kind of behaviors into the place where we don't have to think about it, so we can do it like the riding of the bike or the playing of the piano? I think so many of us would benefit if the trajectory from learning to automatic recreation of what we were learning was an easier path. Why is it so hard?
Well, I feel like there's two different types of the memory. So the emotion we've talked about, and it's almost as if the emotion can almost short circuit or almost trigger. So the emotion changes the internal organ, our internal sense, and it almost alerts the sensory system, the perceptual system to encode the information. But the prefrontal cortex, in a way, is the top-down, more effortful. So I feel like there's a more automatic route to memories going in, but there's also the effortful having to create a strategy, having to focus attention, having to do those things. So why do we need that? Is that related to the evolution of the frontal lobe? I would say probably yes.
There's a lot to be said about experience too, though, and optimizing the brain's ability to predict what's coming next. So I always say that memory is the path or the bridge from the past to the future.
Sure.
So we get better with time. So things that are happening later in life, it's built on a foundation of experiences that can then help the brain bypass that slow learning process you're talking about, and it starts to fill in the blanks based on memory. So new learning is a lot more facilitated.
And if we talk about sorry, go ahead, Veronica.
I'll just say that there's one important point. I suppose memory, in a sense, we're representing the external world in our memory, and we're creating models of the external world in our memory. And the world is full of uncertainty. So I think having very cut and dried shortcuts can lead to representations of the world that are very extreme. So I think we need to maintain skepticism in that sense.
Are you saying so a more gradual process allows more experiences to contribute, and so you don't get wild swings in thinking the world is this way or that way? It kind of averages out over time.
That's right. I mean, memory pathways change very slowly, and that certainly has an evolutionary function because, revolution generally doesn't work. Slow change works. And it's the same with knowledge. It's the same with neuroscience. We build things up very modestly. We move from the periphery in. We don't make big leaps in science. We move in slowly and carefully.
So Oliver, we are all surrounded by an enormous number of memory storage devices, right? We've got hard drives, we've got thumb drives, we walk around with these computers and phones and so forth. There's a more analog version of storage that I think comes to mind when we're talking about memory, which is kind of a film strip, as if the way that we sort of store an event is like these series of still images that are somehow in our brain. Even our opening piece used that metaphor where we had a projector illuminating one still after another in the sprockets of a film strip. Are any of these reasonable metaphors for helping us to understand how memory actually does function?
I mean, in one way, the film strip is not too bad because we're encoding our experience. So if you're in this place, we have vision, we have sound, we have thoughts happening at the same time, and our brain tries to capture all of it. So initially, 1 second afterwards, we literally capture all of it. And then as time goes by, filtering happens, and so we kind of keep like a skeleton of that event after a couple of minutes or later. And if we want to tomorrow remember that event, then our brain will bring back that skeleton version of that event. And I mean, you can already feel that it's not the real thing because you can, if you memorize something, it's not taking over your vision like putting on VR goggles, but it's more like an unclear image, and but it's really a representation of the actual event, so that if you remember something, the same neurons or a subset of the same neurons would become reactivated. So if you look at a new picture, like a new drawing today, and then remember tomorrow, the neurons that are active from seeing the picture and remembering the picture, they will overlap and will be less active by remembering, but it will be maybe 20% of the neurons that get reactivated again. So our visual cortex get active if we remember something visual. Our auditory cortex get activated if we imagine hearing a sound. And for other memories, all of that comes together. So in a sense, it's really just reactivation of patterns that had been active during the actual experience.
So here's the thing. I fully understand how, say, a digital camera can capture an image, at least in principle. I'm not getting into the technology of it, but the photons are coming in and the camera itself is able to measure qualities of the incoming light and store that and then reproduce it in order to give us a digital representation of the image. Good, I understand that. I understand how sound is recorded. I understand sound as a vibration of air, and I understand how vibrations can be encoded even mathematically, and then used to recreate a version of that sound again. But here's the thing that perplexes me a little bit, and perhaps you guys can help me with this. When it comes to the brain, we don't only store the things that you just described. We don't just store the scene. We don't just store the sound. We don't just store the other senses, smell and touch and so forth. We also store our reaction to that stimuli. And when it comes to the reaction, there's such an enormous range of human emotion. How does the molecular structure of this or that molecule in the brain hold on to that kind of almost infinitely variable information? Can you help me get my brain around that?
Well, I don't think it's actually an explicit memory, but what it is at the very deepest molecular level, it's the threshold for the way the neurons will respond in the future. So they call it metaplasticity, right? So it's a change that occurs at deep layers or levels of a cell's function, which changes its responsivity. Okay, so when cells or neurons are firing in the brain, it's a coincidence detector where they'll be at a certain stage of activity. Those neurons become integrated into a new memory. But they themselves then, their threshold for future responsivity has changed forever, right? And then that allows them to be part of the existing memory and future integrations of new information.
But like Veronica, you discussed the hippocampus in your little beautiful mini discourse as the memory maker. Mm-hmm. And I've also read you describe it as sort of the memory indexer. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm pretty sure I read that. How does it do that? In other words, I totally understand that if you're able to recreate similar neural firings to what my brain is doing right now, if you're able to tomorrow get the same neurons to fire as they're firing right now, I should be recreating something that's very close to, like you said, Oliver, it's just a subset, because I don't want my arm to start moving tomorrow when I'm thinking about tonight. I just want to have the memory without the action, and therefore we want to scale out certain things. But how do molecules store enough information to elicit those future neural firings in the right pattern that I can call them up tomorrow? How do they do that?
Well, there are certain neurons that actually encode the temporal context of experience. So they will fire in sequence in combination with the population of cells that are active at the time of an explicit memory. But did you want me to explain the molecular basis?
Maybe just quickly. I wouldn't go too far. Yeah, this is really just for me. You guys can just think about something else for a moment if you don't mind.
Take you through the slide, or?
Oh yeah, why don't we do that? Sure, absolutely.
All right. So every time we experience an emotionally charged event, the brain releases neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin, and those neurotransmitters change the threshold of responsivity of the neurons. And that establishes new contact between neurons. But what we found in recent years is that these neurotransmitters actually enter the nucleus of the cells, of the neurons in our brain, okay? And they find their way in there, and then they start to interact with proteins in the nucleus of the cell. So what you're seeing here is a picture of your DNA, okay? And the yellow is DNA wrapped around these core proteins called histones. And we now know that neurotransmitters that are released during these emotionally charged events actually find their way in and interact with these proteins, these core proteins, and it elicits something called a cascade of epigenetic modifications.
So that's the part of the genome that controls the expression of the genes
themselves.
Yes,
so what happens, you can see that the DNA is tightly wrapped around these proteins under normal situations, and then when they're bombarded with dopamine or serotonin, the DNA relaxes. Now it's accessible for activation. And much like a dimmer switch, okay, there are chemical tags that occur on our DNA in response to learning, which allows the DNA to be turned up or turned down in the moment, but also in priming it for future responsivity. So you can almost say that your memories are causing a change at the level of your DNA. So everything from structure changes, so we know about the right-hand double helix that Watson and Crick discovered, but during a learning event, the DNA will flip and it'll go the other way in a left-handed turn. And that makes it more amenable to modification.
So just so I understand, so the old version that I think many of us are familiar with is we think about memories as synaptic connections, right? Or sort of the wiring of the brain. The hardware doesn't change. In terms of the ingredients, it's just the connections between them changes. Are you suggesting that it's beyond?
It's more than that. So fundamentally, it's still about the contacts between cells. But at a deeper layer, for this whole metaplastic future priming event to respond in the future, there are changes that occur at the level of DNA. Okay, so what happens, like I'm showing there, is there's structure changes in DNA.
And it's the DNA of particular neurons?
There'll be neurons that are active at the time of a given experience, right? So they can be the same or different depending on what experience, like they can be overlapping, right? And there's different regions of the genome that are responding as well. But fundamentally what happens here, and I'll take you through it a little bit, is once that DNA is opened and primed for activation, reader proteins come in and start to read off the code. And then it starts to spit out a molecule that you'll all be aware of now called RNA. And these RNA molecules, there's many different kinds. And they exit the nucleus. Now that we're coming back out, macro level, we're going back out to the synapse again. So these RNA molecules that were expressed from the DNA leave the nucleus, travel along the processes of the cell to the points of contact between other neurons called the synaptic compartment. And there, these RNA molecules do all kinds of interesting things to change the way our cells talk to each other, right? So you have it's two-pronged, right? So you have a signal going in, changes the DNA, makes it more amenable or responsive. The threshold changes for its reactivity. And then that, in turn, sends a message out to establish those contacts between cells, which we all know of, and that leads to long-term memory. So it's both.
And so these RNAs, they're somewhat different than from the traditional RNA molecule that we'd imagine just, going to the ribosomes and coding for proteins. These are somehow making the synaptic connections stronger? Or?
Yeah, well, they're called regulatory RNAs. And it turns out that 98% of our genome actually encodes for these RNAs that don't make a protein. And it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of our understanding, but we're making headway in understanding how certain classes of RNA that don't make a protein are actually transactional, and they process information inside the cell. So they tell different molecules where to go. In this case, they tell molecules that in the synaptic compartment what to do. They're coordinating all these events. And it's pretty interesting when you think about that RNA predated everything, even DNA. RNA was the first molecule on Earth. And now it has this exquisite role in establishing the structural context of memory, right? So it's like an internal software system.
How does the brain keep track so that the process that you just described, you don't write over a previous change? If it was a memory that you want to be stable, presumably you want to go to a different location for this kind of change to take place.
You think every neuron has the opportunity of more than 10,000 contacts with other neurons.
And somehow it keeps track. Let me not, there's, grandma's, 89th birthday, leave that alone. You go to another part of the...
I don't know how, I think that's where the whole idea of recreating memories comes in. Like I can't answer that question explicitly, but I can say that in general, experiences change the threshold of responsivity in neurons, and that the emergent property of that is memory.
And so Oliver, let me ask you this. If I'm going way back, you're remembering something, when I'm 5 years old, and you described it eloquently in terms of, you're coming close to a recreation of the neural firings of the experience when you're 5, and that's how you are having a memory of that time. But my brain now has been undergoing decades of transformation through the processes that we're talking about. So it's a different brain today than it was when I was 5. So how is it the case that those neural firings that are mimicking what my brain was doing decades ago still yields the same kind of memory in a different brain?
I mean, I guess it's careful process of maintenance, so that obviously the cellular changeover in the body would not change the information content, and so therefore, I mean, I think the changes, or the threat of change is actually more coming from experience, or not using information, so that the brain, again, the idea of trying to be efficient, would update information, would kind of downgrade information, and so therefore our interaction is probably a bigger threat from that perspective, even though obviously it would typically act in our favor, than just the typical cellular renewal process that takes place, but would typically leave information intact because, for the same reasons, it's, suddenly it's not that important functions of our brain stop working, because of the changeover, and therefore the same would apply to the memory mechanisms as well.
And can we segue from that to retrieval, right? So that's how memories are formed. And again, anybody jump in on this. How well do we understand the retrieval process, at, say, a physiological level, but also a molecular level?
I mean, it depends on which level you look at, because like looking at the molecular level is very different than, working with patients or doing neuroimaging. So from my perspective, mostly coming from neuroimaging, is looking at pattern completion, so that typically retrieval happens if we get a partial input that reactivates the complete memory. And that partial input can be something from outside, like a smell, a sight, a word that can reactivate the complete memory, or it could be internally generated, that if you want to remember something, then essentially we generate a retrieval key, which then also will just activate that.
But isn't that sort of circular when it comes to the internal version? It almost feels like to generate the memory, I've got to have the memory in order to stimulate the memory. So where does it come from?
One solution to the problem is that our memory is always active to some varying degrees, and some parts of our memory are more active than others. So it's this, you look at it as a network with different levels of activity. So therefore, there's always something active, and we can therefore nudge it more in one direction that leads to more activity in that area, which then leads to it eventually becoming conscious. So lots of our memory are just kind of potentially retrievable, but not in our consciousness. But and only a small aspect of it is currently obviously consciously
There are some ideas that there's active inhibition. So your memories are already always online and ready to go, but they're being actively inhibited. So there's a neurotransmitter called GABA that's critical for that process. And if you relieve the brake, turn down GABA, then it can promote the retrieval of memory. And then there's other ideas that it's even electrical-based signaling, right? It's that gap junctions.
I suppose what I would say between what you're saying, the molecular level is infinitely complex. So if you multiply what you're saying, Tim, by 68 billion, multiply it by 15,000 dendrites potentially per neuron, you have this system of fabulous complexity that's pervasively connected. So you can, it's dizzyingly complex. So you can approach it from any of the levels that we're taking it from, and it's a never-ending story. And the other thing about memory is the brain is a circuit, and not only is the brain a circuit, but the brain and the body is a circuit as well. And if we're talking about memory and emotion, and I suppose this, I'm basically a medic. I think a lot of the time we forget about the body when we're talking about the brain. But remember, emotions, they are experienced in our body. They may be made in the brain, but they're actually experienced within our body. So you can take memory from the level of the Madeleine, from the level of touching somebody's finger, up to the level of trying to understand RNA transactional concepts. Yeah. And it's all memory. It's what makes us human, I think, ultimately.
And that's a good point about the body and the brain connection, so that in cases of traumatic memory, like PTSD, there's this massive drive of the periphery, right, which causes problems with being able to retrieve memories. So some forms of treatment for PTSD actually target the peripheral system. So they give propranolol, which is a beta blocker. People used to use it for high blood pressure. or folks with stage fright, right? So they would suppress the
Nothing
physiological
points towards
response.
me there.
Well, I'm afraid of you, actually. So they suppress the body's response, which then promotes the cognitive function. So it's intimately connected.
And so, Gail, you in your practice, you've dealt with the extremes of memory. And just to get into it, there's a wonderful story. I'm sure many people are familiar with it. Borges wrote the story about a character, Funes, who could not forget anything at all. And at first sight, that sounds like something that many of us would sign up for, right? I mean, when you forget important moments in your life, there's a sense in which they feel gone almost. And yet in this story, this fictional story, it doesn't turn out so well for the character, because when you're not able to forget anything, at least in the hands of Borges, the character couldn't generalize. Everything was so specific. Every event was distinct. There was no category of events that allowed a coherent narrative of life to actually be written. So what's your experience with patients, I gather? There aren't many, but some who can't forget.
That's right, there aren't many. And I have worked with both extremes, those that have lost all their memories as well as those that can't forget. So we're really talking about highly superior autobiographical memory. And actually, I think Rebecca is here, the only person in Australia who actually has that phenomena. But this is something where memories are just coming and arising constantly, many memories. So it becomes intrusive. And we're not talking about memories like 9/11 or, big events that we all remember. We're talking about, what did you have for breakfast? What day is it? What was the weather like? What happened during the day? Did you walk down the road? So these are memories for everyday mundane events that just keep getting stored and stored and stored. So the specifics, as you say, just keep adding up. So it's almost like a filing cabinet that is full of every day of your life. Now, some people can do that from, say, middle childhood or early teen. Rebecca actually goes, quite a long way back. So her mind is constantly giving these memories or bringing them forward.
And at what level of resolution? And again, if I'm probing in a way that somehow is inappropriate, but I mean, is it like what happened at 6:36 p.m. on Tuesday, or is it more?
It can be that specific. I mean, obviously certain things would stand out more. So, if it's a family event or a birthday, but it's personal memories. So when it's related to your personal events, so it's not just memories for information in the news on the day. So it really is about what you did. So for Rebecca, it is what she did on a daily basis. And we've tested that out experimentally, going back, looking at different dates and asking questions and probing that in different ways. And it's actually phenomenal just how much information there is. Now, it comes at a cost. The cost is the intrusion, so she doesn't sleep very well. Or that's a bit of a problem. You've almost got to actively preoccupy your mind in order to be able to get to sleep. Otherwise, it's just constantly having memories or different thoughts keep coming. So,
and is it limited to experience? I mean, for instance, I feel funny. Can Rebecca remember the digits of pi? Is it that?
Well, only if that's of interest. So she can actually remember every line, every bit of the Harry Potter novels. So the 7 Harry Potter novels, because she was interested.
Son, actually.
So we
get together.
We actually compared what she could do with people who also said they were Harry Potter aficionados. So we didn't just pick anybody like me. I haven't read all the books, but we certainly looked at other people that had that interest, but it's different. So it was quite effortful to learn those, but in fact, that information is actually what we call semantic memory, but she has personal memories around learning those books.
And do you understand? I mean, is the brain structure that yields this capacity different from?
Well, no. So structurally, we've actually done some very fancy imaging where we just looked at every structure related to memory. So the hippocampus, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the temporal lobes, every structure, when we compare to sort of a normal data set, they're all like the same size. So it's not like there's a massive hippocampus sitting in her brain. It's not because of that. So, one idea is that it is just the connections, possibly stronger, but we haven't got that evidence. And in fact, worldwide, there isn't really strong evidence that that's the case.
And how many individuals worldwide do we know of with that capacity?
I think there's somewhere between 60 to 100 now. There was about 60, there's probably more at this point.
And this fellow who I remember the name, Solomon Cheryshev, do you know that name? Who was studied by Luria in the Soviet Union?
Yeah,
is
that's
that
right.
another?
There's a whole book on this. So
Okay.
It's slightly different. So that case actually used mnemonics, so had some tricks, and also had more of a photographic memory. So there's some little differences, but it has some similarity. One of the things that really struck me when we were doing some tasks is I showed Rebecca this black and white scene of a beach. Now, I've used this all the time. We elicit spontaneous speech in clinical practice. It takes about a minute. Well, I've shown lots of people, and they've never mentioned colours or sounds. But when Rebecca looked at this scene, she was describing the sounds, the smells, the colours. Well, this is a black and white scene, so the richness of which she is encoding that. So the taste, the smells. So there's a lot of extra information available.
She assigns to the experience.
That's right.
Yeah,
so that she ascribed to that, whereas I've never heard anybody else do that. So it makes me wonder whether actually that information's available to all of us, but maybe we are filtering it out. So in some sense, there's no filter, so the details and the richness are coming in and being retained, whereas you and I were probably, it comes in, it goes away, it just sort of flows through.
Right. So Oliver, I'm just wondering, so Tim described the possibility that memories are kind of always there, they're just suppressed.
Actively inhibited, yeah.
And now this is an example where the memories are always there and they're not suppressed, which can have positive and negative impacts, as you're describing. So what is the role of suppressing or forgetting memories? Is there an evolutionary utility to that?
I would say twofold. I mean, first of all, saving energy in terms of maintaining or building those memories. And, the brain consumes 20% roughly of our energy needs. So that's a good reason. But also to ensure functionality so that, especially evolutionary speaking, often we had to make quick decisions, and we still have, crossing a road and all that. So we have to filter out a lot of information, incoming information, but a lot of our mnemonic information as well, just to be able to react appropriately, because there's always everything comes with a cost. And
absolutely, and like if you park your car yesterday, you need to remember it when you park your car, but today, if it was yesterday, I don't want to know. So it's just taking up space.
Right.
So some things you want to...
But if you forget it, that's my question. If you forget where you parked your car yesterday, has it really been erased, or has it just been suppressed and it's still there?
I would argue you probably didn't encode it in the first place. So when you parked your car and walked into the shopping mall, what were you thinking about? Where the shop you were going to? Were you thinking about what you're doing next, or were you actually focused on what you were doing in the moment?
Well, Oliver, you've actually done studies on the relationship between location and memory, so you have insight into this.
One aspect also, I think, interference is the other one. So that especially with like the parking examples, if you every day park in the same general area, but somewhat often in a different spot, then there's this issue of like overlapping memories, and our brains trying to be efficient and not store, 10,000 entries of where we parked our car, but trying to keep the most relevant. And that sometimes might go wrong because maybe we have paid more attention to yesterday than we kind of did today. So that system is not error-free, but overall it would be still typically calibrated for the best efficiency in our day-to-day life.
And of course, one thing that we all fear is the exact opposite. As we get older and as we're living longer, so many of us experience parents or loved ones who go the other direction. They begin to lose memory. So Is there any insight that we gain from the extreme where one can't forget in order to deal with the extreme where one can't remember?
Well, I mean, I think it's partly related to training and what can you do to maintain or to maximize your memory right now. So this richness of encoding, the attention that goes on that, that's something that from midlife or even earlier life, we can be almost working on or being aware of, making it conscious. So there are practices, things like mindfulness, things like the meditation, attention training, strategy training. So all of those cognitive skills that you can sort of boost and put in top-notch condition, I guess you would say, right from, middle age, I guess, or earlier if you can. Those are good skills to do. Whenever someone says to me, I've always, I lose my keys, I lose this, I always think, what were you thinking about when you did it? And they are always thinking about something else. So their mind, in a sense, is wandered off. So there's those basic things that we can all do to help just keep our focus and our attention being deliberate. And that's the prefrontal cortex also, that top-down control of just our cognitive abilities, our thinking skills. I think we all think it's out of our control, and it is to a degree. There's the biology, sure, but there's certainly a lot of things, minimizing the stress so that we don't shrink our hippocampi. All of those little things really add up, and you want to keep your thinking skills in good condition. It's like you exercise to keep your body in good condition. You can also do training and exercises to help the thinking.
It's interesting because it seems like the cost of experience across the lifespan is the wicked cost is that it leaves you to be on autopilot and you become less attentive to new learning events. So over time, our experience, which is meant to optimize our ability to predict the future based on our memories, actually works against us. Because then we stop paying attention as much because we're on autopilot.
Exactly.
And that kind of integrates into the aging process.
And it becomes that automatic versus the automatic processing versus the active, and I call it the active thinking or active thought. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose I think you could look at it in a slightly different way. I'm not sure they're working against each other, and in a sense, I think we don't need to pay as much attention to things as we gain more experience. And I think that's, you see that particularly in professions where a lot of knowledge is experience-based rather than book-based. And, an older professional, if I was asked to go to a younger or an older doctor, I'd go to the older doctor because I want them to understand at an abstract level what's happening to me. I want them to be quick. I don't want them to do 100 tests. I don't want their attention on every detail that doesn't require that attention. What I want is them to be able to filter through it all and focus on the issues that are important. And I think with memory, we tend to be very focused on executive function, on speed, on attention, but there is an awful lot of abstract information that accumulates over the years, and that's hugely important in terms of in terms of us individually as we age, but also in terms of society. That older wisdom really doesn't need to be part of the way we live together collectively.
But do you think that would have an impact on the processes of memory updating? Right. So there's a theory that every time we recall information, the brain changes its state to enable the updating of new information.
Right.
It's called reconsolidation theory.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that could also be impacted in the aging process as well, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So that there's a kind of a gray zone of what's being updated and what new information is able to come in because of the executive attentional processing that.
So no doubt that explains what I started with my memory of being very young, and I see it as a third-party observer. So I've somehow in the reconsolidation process have changed that memory. So to what extent are our memories as we get older just sort of manufactured using the input of the memory of an earlier stage of life? Are we simply telling ourselves made-up stories that have some semblance of truth?
Corroborated by others.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So, like, I don't know if one can quantify it, but what fraction of my memories are real, and what fraction of them have I just fiddled with over the past decades for one reason or another?
Well, I think there is a reconstruction. So, you almost reconfigure every time you pull the memory out of the drawer.
Yeah.
It depends. If you pull it out now, then this situation is going to influence and, in a sense, combine with that memory. So next time, if I'm sitting on the beach, then that's actually going to interject. So there is a level of construction is one of the words that's thrown around now, where you reconstruct and put it together based on your thought processes at the moment. So there is a combination or a recombining of details in a new way.
And they feel just as real.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And maybe, again, I don't want to get all meta here, but maybe they are real. I mean, they're real to me as an individual, even though they don't have a direct basis in a past experience.
Well, and it may have a seed of a basis in a past experience.
Yes, exactly.
So in some sense, it's almost like the tree growing. It's the same tree, but it's now got a lot more hanging off it. I think it's very individual as well, like how much some people have very strong images or memories for word. I have a niece who almost can word for word regurgitate entire conversations. She's been doing that since she was about 5. So her auditory memory is fantastic. So that's very different from somebody else. So we all have strengths in what remains the core, but then different details come together in a different way.
So given that we all do that throughout our entire lives, is there a chance that in the not too distant future we'll be able to do that volitionally? To be able to do something like, eternal sunshine of the spotless mind? I mean, get into the brain?
Well, maybe you're talking about future thinking, because that's also something now where people really say that if you're constructing your past memories, in fact, it helps us. It's very adaptive in helping us to imagine the future. So it's the same sort of process. So this is quite helpful. If I want to imagine, if I did this and then I did that, and I'm planning to do something in the future, then I can actually work out what the consequences are and then make a choice. Will I do that or not? So I think the memory and talking about this in terms of the past actually can help us think about how do we train or teach people to, in a sense, have more of a metacognition about future.
Well, that's a very useful, obviously important role of memory to guide future behavior, but I'm thinking about something a little bit more intrusive, right? Which is, we began by talking about trauma and its role in creating memory. One can imagine that there are evolutionary usefulness to be able to respond to that, because if that gun is in your face at a future time, you now have experience with that, and that allows you perhaps to deal with that situation with greater efficacy than you would if it was the first time that you encountered it. Good, absolutely. On the other hand, there are downsides, certainly, of having those traumatic memories. Can we learn ways to suppress those? And is that perhaps a way forward? Normally, we talk about something you don't want to suppress. You want to talk it out. You want to work it through. And sometimes that works for many people. For some people, it doesn't. But what if we could go in there and excise that memory?
There is a pretty significant literature on the idea that when memories are retrieved, they're subject to modification. And that's being kind of harnessed as an explicit therapy for people with phobias or PTSD. So when they retrieve that fear response or that memory, there's an intervention that could be applied, right? Back in the 50s, they used ECT, so electroconvulsive therapy, which caused amnesia of the event that was recalled at that moment in time. And then later on in preclinical studies, folks have been using something called protein synthesis inhibitors at the time of retrieval right? So when the memory is in that labile state, they can intervene and erase the memory that was reactivated.
And how effective is
Well,
that?
Now we're moving into this, I mentioned propranolol. That is one therapeutic approach to helping folks with PTSD and phobia, to help them suppress those invasive memories.
And is that viewed as in the clinical world, is that viewed as a promising way of going forward?
Well, I think first of all, the initial point you made is very important, that it's not always good to talk, and it's not always good to ventilate, and it's not always good to re-traumatize somebody by reopening those pathways in a very vivid way. And sometimes it's more appropriate, particularly in situations of more severe trauma, to try and forget. And certainly in my work, I've seen people who've had psychotic experiences that are really quite horrifying. I think it's very difficult for us to imagine psychotic experiences unless we have been psychotic ourselves. I mean, essentially what you're hearing voices the way you are hearing me now. So they're not voices in your head, as is commonly thought. They are voices out there. And if there's nobody there, well then there may be hidden speakers in the wall. There may be extraterrestrials from Mars that are listening in that somehow we can't see. So all sorts of bizarre and dark and sometimes grotesque worlds are attributed by what are usually nasty auditory hallucinations. And in situations like that, certainly it would be untherapeutic to try and do anything other than try and explain to the person that their brain was firing off and that they were having all these experiences, that they're not based in reality, and that they're better off coming into what I call the shared reality, that we're all lucky enough, if we are lucky enough, to be able to share in. You're all hearing my voice. You're not hearing some other voice that's trying to talk over mine. So you're not confused. You're in the world. You're in the moment. You're in the shared consciousness that we're all a part of. So certainly in situations like that, I think it's counter-therapeutic to go into therapy, to delve in, to investigate those experiences. And
if we come back to just thinking about the memory of that, you're strengthening it. By going back, you're actually adding to it, and it becomes almost stronger.
Yeah.
And in some situations, I think, Tim, you're probably referring to phobias. So in that sense, sometimes you can change the association with the memory, and that's based on some of the different Pavlovian type learning. Yeah. So you can actually weaken that or strengthen something else to it. So you can meddle with memories in that sense, which can be harmful
create new memories
and helpful.
To override the old ones. Yeah.
And that's the clinical decision making as to when do you do that, when do you not.
Yeah.
So one final area in the remaining time that just want to spend a little time on asking you about. I think many of us think of our personal identity as being bound up with our memories, or maybe even being our memories. It's almost as if I am the collection of my memories. That is who I am, right? That's what distinguishes me from others. In your clinical work and research work, do you come to a more nuanced version of that, or a solidified version that really is what we are as human beings? Long collections of memories that summarize our experience as a living system on planet Earth. Oliver?
I guess we can look at identity from two sides. Yeah. From the outside, obviously, even if we lose our memory, the people surrounding us still have memories of us. So, but I think from our personal point of view, in terms of who we think we are, memories would be crucial, and therefore it would make sense, given that we forget a lot of information, that our sense of identity is somewhat changing, when we age. And the more information you would have about our childhood, I guess that would enrich our identity. So I think, yes, definitely intimately linked. memories of ourselves. And
Yeah, and I immediately think of a patient I worked with. I was working in London at the time, Sheena MacDonald. She was quite a public figure, and she had a severe brain injury from being run over by a police van. And she actually made a documentary, Who Am I Now If I Don't Have My Memory? Was really the whole premise of that. And she really felt that her identity was affected. She had quite severe, she was in a coma, and then she had post-traumatic amnesia, which was a stage where she wasn't laying down new memories for about 6 weeks. And then it was about 6 months that she had patchy memories. But she struggled, and she repeatedly came back to that question. And that made me change my view and really think about our identity. And when you lose that memory, you maybe feel the same, but she was asking, am I really the same, or do I just think I am? And I guess for all of us, I don't know, as I get older, I certainly feel that I think that some of the details or the detailed memories disappear a little bit, but I don't feel that that's changed my identity.
As if there's some essential core that's you, and the memories somehow wrap around that, but if the memories go, the core still persists.
Still there.
But if you don't have a frame of reference of people that recognize you and you recognize them, even if they're telling you things about yourself that you would have once known, then you don't have a sense of who you are, right? Without that recognition of the person sitting in front of you, right?
Yes, so there's a sense that, my identity is tied to the group. Who is around me and how do you relate to me? Partly that's where group and social psychology comes in, where the identity is formed in relation to others or in relation to what you think I am, or how you even relate to me.
If you walked into a room and you didn't recognize anyone, every time you walked into the room, it would be very disturbing. I think your foundation would be unstable, right?
Yeah, I think we're coming back again and again to the whole issue of connectivity. And I mean, we all live in a moment of consciousness. So our memory and the past exists in the present. And it is in the conscious moment of the present that we predict the future as well. And I think that the human race is very like memory. We're living in a current situation, but we have a high level of awareness of the past, and we're trying to prevent past mistakes in our future behavior. And I think we are evolving as a species in the same way that we evolve and develop personally. So memory binds us together. It was like coming back to the 9/11. We all watched the same clip visually again and again and again, and that consolidated that memory. That is a collective memory that we will always share and that will always be with us. And we're not going to get New York confused with Chicago in that memory, because that's a very solid core memory.
And also the pizza's quite different between the two as well, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's about connection, and I really think as you get older, that's one of the wonderful things about not being young and being older, is that your sense of connection with the world, I think, expands. So that the big collective memory that is the human race and the human project that we're all a part of, we're all a part of a collective memory. We're all a part of that project. And yes, Jean-Paul Sartre said, we make a narrative and then we recreate it, and we recreate it constantly. And Alice Munro said something very similar in the last decade. So we are evolving, but memory is important because we learn from that in the journey in terms of moving forward.
And so as we look to the future, one can imagine that the rapid increase in our technological facility will allow for an interface between the biological and the technological. Do you envision that there will be a time that human memory is not just a collection of molecules in this gloppy 3-pound squishy gray structure that sits in this bony cave perched on our shoulders, but rather we're able to hook up to other devices that can assist us so that, we don't have to have this worry about losing memories or suppressing memories. We just sort of put them off to the external, and then we bring it back whenever we want. Is that science fiction, or is that something that you think is potentially going to happen?
I feel in many ways we're already offloading our memory.
In what sense?
Using iPhones and devices as our guides, right?
With us as the intermediary at the moment.
But we don't have to worry about phone numbers anymore. We don't have to worry about how to drive or where to drive our car. We're not reading maps anymore.
Yeah.
We just have that.
But are they not more the mechanistic aspects of memory? They're like the non-human parts of memory. And I'm very happy that my children don't have to learn times tables anymore.
A London taxi driver would speak otherwise.
That's right. They used to be incredible. But now,
I know. But I still think that there is human memory, and human memory is part of the human condition. And a machine will never mimic that in my books.
I mean, in some ways, you're talking about, the semantic memory we can offload, and these personal, autobiographical, the things that are essentially relevant and personal. That is the human bit too.
And that's also those memories which we don't have to pay lots of effort to encode. We were talked earlier about it, how hard it is to memorize, but it typically only pertains to information that you might not have an interest in. So once you develop an interest, then it's not difficult anymore. And so like Harry Potter books, the example, like everybody who's a Harry Potter fan would have no problem memorizing the story, reads it once and can answer the questions. But it's much harder with the times table, and therefore, like the social memory, social relationship, those aspects that kind of come natural to us.
Maybe we lean on technology a bit more, and then it frees up creativity.
That's right.
It's a positive way of putting it. Yeah.
And so, we began this conversation, like one of the initial questions I asked was, how is it possible that molecules can store the feeling of a warm breeze on the ocean, or the sensation of a birthday cake when you're 6 years old. But underlying that specific question, which has to do with memory, is the allied question of consciousness, right? How is it possible that matter can yield mind? How is it possible that matter can yield these inner worlds of sensation, of which memory, of course, is an integral part, but there's the whole world inside of our heads. Does your work on memory make you feel that you're getting closer to an answer to that question as to what is consciousness? And do you think that it is simply physical, or do you think it's something beyond the physical?
I think our work gives us a sense of the complexity of the processes involved, and that just and how much more complex the processes would be to, I guess, fully understand and explain processes like consciousness. And
what do you think? Is it simply matter creating consciousness, or is it something else?
I mean, it would be hard to say with certainty, because I guess we're not there yet to kind of pinpoint it with certainty. So.
Oh, come on, say with some certainty.
Well, so open for surprises,
I don't think there's something out there, if that's the question you're asking.
Well, is there something beyond the molecules?
I
don't think that there is, but many people disagree with that.
It's the complexity.
I would have thought that you would say that there is. My guess would have been that you would have thought that there is. But am I wrong?
You're absolutely wrong.
Okay.
No, consciousness is a multi-layered thing.
Yes.
And at the outer reaches of consciousness, we are looking at ourselves. And that is why we have a feeling as if there is something out there.
I agree with you.
But that is the ultimate in consciousness.
And
that feeling that there is something
Gail,
out there.
where do you come down on that?
Well, I like when you bring in different levels of complexity. So energy, matter, what does it give rise to? Is there something is it all just within me? I think energy extends beyond. I think it's partly in the relationship with different things. So I think that the energy is actually quite key in all of that. So I don't think, which is in the molecules, which is in the little levels, it's in the bigger levels. So I'm probably more on I think there are some metaphysical or some things that are bigger than what we can imagine right now. I think it's a little bit too reductionist to say it's the little molecules running around and that's it.
Now, I noticed the expression on your face when you said reduction like that.
Reduction.
For me, it'd be, it's reductionism. It's just sort of a
well,
different...
no, I guess, I am very interested in creativity and creative thought and how do you generate new ideas. So for me, I feel like I don't want to reduce down to the littlest level of molecule. I like the complexity of when things come together synergistically and make something beyond what's actually just there. So I don't know whether that's a physical beyond what's there or whether I'm saying it's an energy beyond what's there, but I think that there's more.
Yeah, so the only thing that I would say to that, and then I'll leave it to Tim to take us out, I don't consider that we are reducing things through reductionism, even though the words sound so similar, have the same root. Rather, I think it's utterly remarkable that these ingredients called atoms and molecules can somehow come together in complex ways and yield the creative impulse and the creative output. I mean, how remarkable is it that molecules can look at themselves and wonder about how those molecules are doing what they're doing?
I agree. We're on the same page then, in that sense.
Your view, Tim?
Oh, well, I have a lot of things to say about that. But
well, let me tell you, you have negative 1 minute and 22 seconds to do it. So
we've got DNA. It's a 4-base code, right? Yeah. Computers are made of ones and zeros. So already we have a device that's inside of us that has a computational memory storage. It's a quadratic improvement, right? And then on top of that, 4 bases, and each of the 4 bases can be chemically modified in 4 or 5 different ways, which again offers an opportunity for an incredible amount of storage.
Yes.
Memory.
But is that a full description, do you think, of what's happening inside of our heads, or not? I suspect you think that it is, but I don't want to put words because I got it wrong once already.
No, I'd like to think that there's the capacity for a great amount of storage at the level of our DNA. So I can break it down to the most reductionist level. We could talk about fermions another day.
Right. Well, that's anyone want to give a final remark before we wrap it up? Or so this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation on mind, memory, consciousness, trauma, emotion, and the swirl of all of these ingredients that yield this structure that we call the human being. So I want to thank you 4 human beings for joining us here tonight for this discussion. Please thank our group.